Today's Critical Conversation is part of the Critical Conversations Project, a series of thematic roundtable discussions conducted by ACSF in partnership with Princeton's Center of Theological Inquiry. The goal of these critical conversations is to broaden our view of how the built environment may help us to respond to the great challenges facing our world today. We have convened a group of experts from a variety of disciplines to consider the cultural, ethical, environmental, and transcendent aspects of the built environment, with a particular attention to the role of spirituality. The first Critical Conversations Project webinar was conducted on May 6th of this year, which you can watch on the ACSF YouTube channel. Together, these two May conversations are a prelude, or what we've called a prequel, to the sessions that will take place at CTI in Princeton next academic year. The topics for today's conversations are justice and participation in environmental adaptation and ecotechnology. In the first, we ask the fundamental question of how can built environments support equity and inclusion and encourage participatory and democratic decision-making processes. And for the second, how may sustainable built and natural ecosystems be in spiritual and material harmony with nature, the cosmos, and the resources of the earth? We begin with the premise that humans are very intelligent creatures, but not highly evolved ones. In our relatively short time on the earth, we have made remarkable progress in creating environments that support our needs and advance our knowledge. The Anthropocene has established our dominance as a species and produced an astonishing spectrum of accomplishments and knowledge. However, our successes have also resulted in profound challenges to future flourishing and survival of our and other species. Organized religions have played a crucial role in our successes and still have much to offer, but are often missing essential perspectives to address the world we have created. The emergence of a more generalized spirituality that draws from a variety of wisdom traditions is a response to this deficiency. A common theme is the imperative to deepen our consciousness of the interdependence between our individual and collective lives and the earth that supports them. Our five panelists will begin with short presentations on these topics. This will be followed by questions, answers, and discussions. Please submit your questions via the chat channel on Zoom, and we will finish promptly at 1:30. First, let me introduce our panelists, and this is in the same order that they will present their opening statements. Thomas Fisher is a professor in the School of Architecture, director of the Minnesota Design Center, and former dean of the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. A graduate of Cornell University in Architecture and Case Western Reserve University in Intellectual History, he was the editorial director of Progressive Architecture magazine and was recognized in 2005 as one of the nation's most published architecture writers, having written 12 books, over 60 book chapters, and over 450 journal articles. Roberto Chiotti is a fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and founding principal of Larkin Architect Limited, an award-winning firm specializing in the design of sustainable sacred space. He completed graduate studies in theology and ecology through the Elliott Allen Institute at the University of St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, currently serves on the board of ACSF, and co-authored the ACSF Declaration of Transcendent Human Habitat with fellow ACSF board members Tammy Gaber, Julio Bermudez, and Nadir Ardalan. Karla Britton is professor of art history at Diné College of the Navajo Nation. Her work focuses on sacred architecture, and she oversees grants on Navajo artists and economic development. Her Ph.D. is from Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and she is taught at Columbia University and Yale School of Architecture. She was also resident of the Center of Theological Inquiry, Princeton, and recently co-edited Modern Architecture and the Life World. Tom Beaudoin is professor of religion at Fordham University in New York City. The author of numerous publications on theology and cultural practices, he is currently researching the Pantheon in Rome with a grant from the Templeton Religion Trust that is focused on developing a theological account of the significance of the Pantheon's architecture and artworks informed by the experience of the Pantheon's visitors. Bryan Bell is a public interest designer, writer, and associate professor at NC State University. In 1991, he founded the nonprofit organization Design Corps with the mission to serve the 98% without architects. Bell's current work includes the SEED Network, which he co-founded. He has co-written and co-edited 5 books, organized 19 Structures for Inclusion international conferences, and held 33 public interest design institutes. So we will start with Tom Fisher.
Thank you, Tom. The year 2020 represented a tipping point for not just one, but 3 pandemics. The pandemic of COVID-19, but also of institutionalized racism and of climate change. These 3 pandemics may seem unrelated, but they are all the result of a several century-long Ponzi scheme with the planet that the global North, mostly European and North American nations, have perpetrated on the global South and on Earth itself. That Ponzi scheme has involved the extraction of fossil fuels and other finite resources, which has prompted climate change, the exploitation of Black and brown people, which has led to institutionalized racism, and the expansion of human settlements into wilderness areas, which has led to zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. As we learned from the Ponzi scheme of Bernard Madoff, who died this year in prison, the larger the scheme and the more people who have bought into it, the more we don't see it and don't want to talk about it. That is especially true for the global North, where roughly 1 billion people have benefited enormously from the scheme at the expense of 6 billion others, as well as other species and future generations. But Ponzi schemes are unstable. They collapse when people refuse to participate in them or when they get called out as a fraud, which is what began to happen in 2020. People around the world demanded an end to police brutality and the exploitation of people of color, an end to fossil fuel extraction and the extreme weather events its use has caused, and an end to the expansion of human settlements into natural areas and the novel viruses that come with that. 2020, in other words, marked the beginning of the end of our planetary Ponzi scheme. And it forces us to ask what a post-Ponzi scheme, post-pandemic human existence might be like. Architects have a key role to play in helping envision what that might entail, especially since this profession has had a major role in perpetrating the Ponzi scheme through the materials we specify, the energy we use, the clients we serve, the inequities we accept, and the segregation we perpetrate in the built environment. A post-Ponzi scheme architecture will need to be more local and more global in the right ways. More local in the materials we use, in the economies we support, and in the communities we engage. And at the same time, more global in the measurable benefits our design decisions have on the natural environment, on social equity, and on economic opportunity. A post-Ponzi built environment will also need to be simpler and more adaptable at the same time. The pandemics of 2020 accelerated us into a future in which people will have more choices in terms of what we do remotely or face-to-face. forcing the built environment to compete with the digital environment in terms of what we do where. This, in turn, has challenged one of the key assumptions of the Ponzi scheme, that we occupy specialized buildings during specific times of the day or week, and often in single-use districts, requiring extensive travel from one place to the next, and leading to an extraordinary amount of underutilized, resource-intensive built space. Architects have greatly benefited from this excess production of space. Indeed, the modern profession of architecture, with its educational and licensure requirements, largely coincides with the emergence of specialized building types in the 19th century. But in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the midst of the Ponzi scheme's collapse, that will likely change. The year 2020 showed how many different activities can happen in the same space, as many people worked, learned, shopped, and produced in their own homes, recalling the household-based economies that widely existed prior to the 19th century. Rather than specialized building types, we have accelerated into a digital future in which the adaptability of every building to multiple uses will be the norm. This will require a lot of adaptive use of the extraordinary amount of excess built space we have created, and an embrace of all 7+ billion people on the planet as our clients, not just those who have benefited the most from the Ponzi scheme and have the most to lose from its collapse. We have, for example, more than enough space to house every person and community that lacks safe and secure shelter when we end our Ponzi scheme perpetrating habit of specifying particular uses in functionally singular buildings. Likewise, we have more than enough land to accommodate our needs and those of other species when we stop our Ponzi scheme-fueled destruction of native habitat in indigenous cultures. Humanity has existed for 95% of our history living in nomadic, sharing communities. And only in the last 5% of our past did we begin to live in permanent settlements in architecture. And only in the last 0.2% of our history did we depend upon a Ponzi scheme to enrich a few at the expense of everyone else. A post-Ponzi scheme existence may see the emergence of a new kind of architecture, one that is highly adaptable to accommodate a diversity of activities at all times of the day and week, that generates its own power and minimizes its carbon footprint, that creates as much habitat for other species as we do for ourselves, that uses local materials and recycles its waste, that encourages local economies and opportunities for every person in a community, and that gives everyone access to affordable, safe, and secure shelter. Post-Ponzi scheme architecture, in other words, is one that refuses to exploit, extinguish, extract, and expand beyond what is our due. And this is a spiritual crisis as much as a material and ethical one. The assumption deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian worldview that humanity is separate from and superior to other species is a deeply flawed idea that has brought us to this point where we are creating an existential threat to our very survival on this planet. This demands that we come to terms with the fact that we are just one species among millions, and an immature species at that, and that we must grow up and learn how other species manage to thrive on this earth as a guide to what a post-pandemic world might be like for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Roberto.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Julio and Tom for organizing these important conversations, and to say that I am honored and humbled to participate in the discussion today with such esteemed panelists. I would also like to thank the many colleagues and friends who have joined us here today. So my personal point of entry into the discourse on environmental adaptation and ecotechnology is from two seemingly disparate and yet for me inextricably interrelated perspectives. The first is rooted in an architectural practice that is dedicated to the design of sustainable sacred space. The second comes from a grounding in eco-theology that embraces cultural historian Thomas Barrie, spelled B-E-R-R-Y, assertion that the universe and most imminently the earth in all of its awesome diversity and natural splendor, provides us with the primary revelatory experience of the divine. So it is from these vantage points that emerge the following foundational positions and inquiries from which I will engage the other participants when we meet at Princeton Center for Theological Inquiry in 2022. The basic challenge for me has always been that the discourse surrounding the topics of environmental adaptation and ecotechnology have been grounded in the current dysfunctional worldview that can be further described as Western, imperialist, capitalist, characterized by destructive patterns of production and consumption, and thus focused on making small incremental improvements to current outmoded methods and technologies that inevitably enable us to defer indefinitely the transformational change required to bring about a viable human future that is actually worth living in. That conversation is only now beginning to shift in some circles as we approach the deadline for achieving the goals of net positive energy and zero carbon buildings established by the American Institute of Architects and the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's 2030 Challenge. My contention is that, as Alberto Perez Gomez admonished during the previous webinar, the ways of achieving these goals remains transfixed by the default premise that solutions can only come from technology itself. I would suggest that we need to relinquish this mantra and quickly acknowledge that adequate solutions to the ecological crisis can only emerge if we allow ourselves, in the words of Michael Benedict, to expand our empathetic horizon from one that is egocentric towards one that is earth-centric. Since design is a fundamentally worldview activity, it will be imperative that we immediately forfeit human exceptionalism as an a priori value in favor of an earth-centric perspective that, according to Barrie, recognizes the Earth's needs as primary and those of the human community as derivative. It is hubris to expect that we can sustain a healthy human community on an unhealthy planet. To be sure, there is a sense of urgency that we must all be feeling. The indicators of climate change and its consequent uncertainties, inequities, and conflicts seem to be making headlines on a daily basis. So how do we begin the transformation towards a functional cosmology that will enable humanity to achieve a less exploitive, more mutually enhancing relationship with the Earth, as Barrie would say? I would suggest, like Barrie, that we must first of all recognize the Earth as a sacred reality, one that from the moments of its emergence within our solar system has had a psycho-spiritual dimension in addition to its physical material dimension. We must come to understand the dynamics that informed its self-educating, self-regulating evolution over its 4.5 billion years of existence, always moving towards what Barrie describes as greater diversity or differentiation, greater subjectivity or interiority, and greater communion or interrelationship. Perhaps as designers, we can take time out from problem solving for a moment and instead engaging all of our senses to be actively, empathetically attentive to the natural world so that we can begin to align our thinking with nature instead of against it. We might then begin to appreciate that the Earth demonstrates itself to be the primary designer and the primary art educator. Perhaps then we can realize the inadequacies of terminology such as ecotechnology, which fails to describe the dynamic complexities, sublime poetics, and delicate nuances that characterize the many natural systems working in harmony to support life on the planet. As an architect, my own creativity is directly dependent upon the diversity and creativity that makes itself present in creation. With every species that goes extinct, with every part of the natural world that becomes degraded, with every sacred voice that gets silenced, my own interiority, subjectivity, and creativity is diminished. But let us not be deterred. let me return to Alberto's encouragement for designers to think outside the box. And from my own perspective as a designer, to serve the earth as our client, and the needs of those actually paying our fees as secondary. I look forward to working with the CTI scholars and subject panelists next February to imagine and develop meaningful and effective strategies that will contribute towards achieving greater diversity, greater subjectivity, and greater communion. But finally, I would like to add that my contribution will be based upon the understanding that the topics covered by the critical conversations cannot be addressed in isolation. Rather, each must be approached as part of a broader interrelated and interconnected inquiry. So in the context of today's other topic, which focuses on issues of justice and participation, I cannot ignore the fact that my own subject must be considered within the greater context of the socio-political landscape in Canada. That is where and how justice and participation are played out in the development decisions associated with our human habitats and the infrastructure necessary to support them. I'm happy to say that Canada's judiciary is finally recognizing treaty rights, which means that Canada is now being obliged to move beyond the duty to consult with Indigenous peoples towards requiring their free and prior consent when it comes to infrastructure development that will impact their treaty lands and unceded territories. This will necessarily have a profound influence on the fossil fuel and other resource extraction sectors, as well as the ongoing development of the built environment and infrastructure projects such as pipelines. As we begin to learn from and embrace Indigenous cosmologies, wisdom, and values associated with their governance relationships to each other, to the land and waterways, and to all living and non-living entities in contribution to solving the ecological crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Karla.
There. Okay. Thank you, Tom, for including me as part of this critical discussion on justice and the built environment. A few weeks ago, in reference to these workshops, my colleague Nader Ardalan suggested that each of us should begin by presenting our epistemological stance by way of framing our comments as part of this discussion. So I've kept Nader's charge in mind while writing and preparing these comments. As a historian of architecture, I've been immersed in European concepts of spirituality, especially as they pertain to sacred architecture and the built environment. Yet since the fall of 2018, I've taught at Diné College on the Navajo Nation, which is the first tribal college in North America, focuses on preserving Diné or Navajo culture and language. Since I began teaching among the Navajos, my European formation and intellectual assumptions have necessarily been broadened and, of course, challenged. I'm struck, excuse me, just a minute. I'm still learning about the matrix of beliefs and practices that inform Navajo culture, specifically how the individual is shaped by a worldview, often summarized as Saha Naga Beke Hojon, often referred to by the acronym SNBH. It is a phrase that is translated in various ways, but is generally understood to mean one's journey of striving to live a long and harmonious life. It emphasizes a holistic approach to human living in which every living thing has its own rightful place. And so a concept like justice is understood to mean living in harmony with and having respect for all things. What the Navajo summarize with the word hojo, meaning the way of beauty. Now, in the European perspective, justice has tended to be viewed by analytical philosophy as being related to the right distribution of scarce goods. There is, for example, the utilitarian theory of justice of Jeremy Bentham, who defined justice as the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or John Stuart Mills, who defined justice in terms of obligation, or more recently, John Rawls, who advocated for justice to be equated with an individual freedom of choice. One might also talk about justice in terms of the Christian tradition as the enactment of the demands of love. The contemporary theologian Rowan Williams, for example, cautions against understanding justice as merely a matter of discharging clearly defined debts. For Williams, we should not lose sight of how and why we raise the question of justice, which is to promote human well-being. Williams' perspective is reflective of similar theological responses to more secular understandings of justice as merely some morally required demand for equal or fair distribution of goods. For Williams, the language of justice needs to move away from seeing it as rectifying an imbalance in social goods to being focused in a deeper language about modes of human relating and to actual human beings in need. In the field of architecture, as many of you know, Hannah Arendt's idea of the public sphere has informed many of the political theories shaping our discourses and debates on justice over the last 4 decades. The public sphere is, of course, the arena in which any regard for justice is enacted and where the claims of human being in need are met. Picking up on this core conviction, notable theorists of architecture like Kenneth Frampton and George Baird have addressed the theme of architecture's relationship to the public sphere, especially as it is enacted in what Arendt called the space of appearance, by which she meant that place where I appear to others as others appear to me, where people exist not merely like other living or inanimate things, but to make their appearance explicitly. Interestingly, Williams and Arendt's ideas of justice move toward a more social conception of the idea. Justice for them, philosophically, in many ways, point back toward a more Platonic concept. Plato, of course, argued in the Republic that justice in the state is analogous to the proper harmony of the 3 elements of the individual mind, of reason, of spirit, and desire. The individual and society as a whole are both just to the extent that they maintain an ordered balance. Yet all these accounts of justice remain distinctly anthropocentric, especially when compared to the Navajo concept of Hojo. So to return to the question that Nader raised, what is my epistemological position on the topic of justice, and for that matter, spirituality? Increasingly, I think it is informed more by Native ideas such as Hojo, emphasizing a communal approach to well-being, health, and happiness that is always tied to family, to place, to earth, and to community. In that sense, it is quite a departure from my intellectual roots, but it is a framework that seems especially relevant in today's political and economic climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Karla. Thomas.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Julio, both of you for organizing this conversation and for inviting me into this esteemed company. And I want to thank everybody here for coming today. My short intervention here is called Participating in Nothing, ? How might nothingness open ways of considering and encouraging justice and participation in architecture? I want to track nothingness as it has been used in some architectural research, the philosophical and theological heritages on which this research draws, how nothingness might relate to more influential terms in the study of sacred architecture, and how nothingness might be operationalized in research on the built environment. I wonder if nothingness helps in studying the significance of the built environment that takes account of the experiences of publics who have differential relationships to the normative meanings of sacred buildings, such as those who are hosted in a built environment, in contrast to those who are the hosts. I also wonder if nothingness might do so in a way that evades a bifurcated frame for significance, like sacred, secular, physical, metaphysical, ordinary, extraordinary, or the like. I'm motivated by my broad interest in how religiously assigned built environments, like churches or temples, often edify a variety of experiencers on the margins of or outside that religion, even though the building was designed or maintained for the purposes of a sponsoring religious organization. This is especially timely as Christian churches are forced to consider a new public role where Christianity is in decline. More specifically, I am motivated by my interest in how the Pantheon in Rome, perhaps the most influential Western architectural achievement, spoke as effectively of and to Roman imperial politics and religion in the 2nd century CE, as it has to Roman Catholicism from the 7th century forward, and how this speaking has been entangled with a power structure and message of domination that the architecture and its ongoing curation can be said to express and authorize. Yet it is also the case that from antiquity to today, the Pantheon's architecture also solicits other anti-colonial or non-dominating responses that cut against the presenting ideology. And those possibilities of other meanings can be glimpsed in the experiences of diverse visitors from many religions and cultures. Some visitors find in the Pantheon an experience that mirrors the official Catholic message, but many also find something else, a different kind of significance. Diverse visitor experience of the architecture seldom includes predominant church and scholarly narratives about or curations of the Pantheon. Julio Bermudez's work is a notable exception. For justice and participation questions, I think the Pantheon is a provocative example of a Christian church whose significance is more than Christian. Yet the way the architecture bears a more than Christianness today remains obscure. Might an orientation in nothingness help here? And how might this inquiry teach about justice and participation in ways that can promote further justice and participation in shared cultural heritage, religious architecture sites like the Pantheon? This is where I want to explore a potential contribution from what looks to me to be the minor tradition of nothingness in the literature on sacred architecture. For Frank Lyons, in The Architecture of Nothingness, certain architecture can conduct people into nothing, or a noumenal reality present in phenomenal reality. For Jin Baek, in Nothingness, Tadao Ando's Christian sacred space, nothingness is what certain architecture allows in facilitating an experience of the primordial co-implication of body and world. Will considering the value of nothingness be a way of greater hospitality and even reciprocity among diverse publics for the design, curation, or study of sacred architecture? I come to these questions as a white, able-bodied man, a theologian in a Catholic heritage university, from outside the world of architectural design, architectural teaching, architectural learning. These afford me both advantages as well as limitations as I join you in beginning our shared endeavor.
Thank you, Tom. Bryan.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be part of these critical conversations. Thank you for including me. Seeking confluence of interests. Design can support equity and inclusion by being a means to encourage civic participation. When designs are built that manifest inclusive involvement and realize shared goals, it provides evidence that participation is valid and that physical results are realized and tangible. This inclusion of the public in the design process not only encourages active citizenship, but it can also create equity through a sense of fairness, through shared ownership for all those involved. The most basic understanding of a community is that there is something that is shared, held in common. A design project can be used here to connect separate individuals and groups and form a confluence of interests. Collectively, these shared interests and shared resources can make projects become possible, projects that none of these singular entities have the ability or resources to produce. This combination of assets and interests can bring social capital and resources to where they are needed most. I'll present two examples that use this process of equity creating decision-making to seek the common good. One is at the design project scale, and one is at the global network scale. The process yields similar benefits in both. The sociogram you see here represents the ecosystem of a design project, in this case, a community health center, a building, by representing outcomes, program, and stakeholders. The dark gray rectangles feature the outcomes that the building will provide, which are the positive changes that will result. Orange circles reveal the programmatic pieces or activities that the building will house. Gray circles represent the partners who have an interest or stake in the outcome and will contribute to the programming activities. Although every stakeholder does not have an identical role or interest in the project, the diagram shows how multiple goals can be combined into one building and a collective vision of success. Having one building serve multiple stakeholders and address multiple challenges has a multiplier effect on its value. In addition to validating equitable decision-making, this approach of seeking the confluence of interest can also address one form of injustice in the world, the unequal distribution of resources. Thomas Malthus postulated that there are limited resources in the world and that survival is based on who has them. What if we can increase the impact of this proverbial pie of limited resources? As was quoted in our Critical Conversations brief, Rahul Malhotra has said that the challenge of our time is to do much, much more with much, much less, which suggests an alternative to the Malthusian limits. How is this possible? While the Earth's physical resources are limited, now more than ever, social capital is not. Social capital can, in fact, increase the value of limited physical resources by taking a multiple stakeholder approach when it seeks a common vision of success for all. As shown in the sociogram, there's a multiplier effect of resources and successes when multiple groups value the same output. Sergio Pallaroni, who is the director of the Center for Public Interest Design at Portland State, has said that 90% of the value of his architecture projects are beyond the bricks and mortars used. By looking at a building's outcome, not just its floor plan, we include much more than square feet. Even in the very process of inclusive decision-making, equity and community can be increased almost regardless of physical resources required. So an investment, say, of $1 or use of 1 pound of steel can yield additional 9 times the value and outcomes. The second example operates at the global scale of social networks and uses the same process to seek a confluence of interest. This example is through one initiative called Design for the Common Good. Design for the Common Good is a network of multiple networks that together offer a platform to coordinate what is shared by these groups. In the diagram, every time there is an overlap of interests, we multiply the impact of our effort. In practical terms, we have used means such as shared awards and conferences to understand our common goals and then advocate together for them. The first collaboration occurred in 2017 between the SEED Network, Design Build Exchange, which is out of Germany, and Live Projects, which is out of the UK. A year later, the Pacific Rim Network joined for another joint conference and awards. Most recently, in 2020, collaboration started between the SEED Network, the National Organization of Minority Architects, NOMA, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, resulting in juried awards and conference sessions on, quote, designs that advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, unquote. Certainly a timely public conversation during the rise of Black Lives Matter. Note that even though the NAACP is not a design organization, we're able to find common ground with them. The 3 organizations first used an open-ended survey of all our members to develop a shared set of criteria about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. These responses created a basis for a national award program that was juried by 12 nationally recognized activists, educators, and practitioners of JEDI. These projects then became case studies and are being used to educate, train emerging professionals, and community activists in upcoming webinars, workshops, and podcasts. In fact, we have our first one tomorrow. At both small and large scales, finding the highest and best use of materials to meet the priorities of most stakeholders and address the most critical challenges can be accomplished through this creative process of iterative, inclusive design. Finding the unknown unique solution that meets the confluence of interests requires great imagination. Possibly, in my mind, one of the highest and best use of a designer's imagination. Social capital is not limited, and neither is imagination. In his essay on cosmic religion with other opinions and aphorisms, Albert Einstein stated, imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. Here I would note is a role for designers. Returning to equity and inclusion, where I began, if design helps demonstrate these values of civic participation, then communities and individuals could be further encouraged to become activists and advocates for themselves, for the built environment, and for progress well beyond the built environment. Thank you.
All right, and thank you to all our panelists for your opening statements. So just want to remind everyone that you can post your questions in the chat of Zoom, and we'll be very happy to address questions from all of our participants who would like to do so. I'll get things going with, I think our panelists will probably see this as a fairly general, let's open up the conversation, maybe open our lens a little bit, question. Your statements outline complementary aspects of contemporary spirituality: a willingness to honestly confront issues, a search for new orientations to understand them, an emphasis on synthesizing a diverse range of positions, a reverence for the world we inhabit, a recognition of one's inherent personal and ethical responsibilities, and the value of collective and inclusive means of gathering a community. like to ask each or all of you to talk about how informed spiritual orientations, as you understand them, can aid in addressing the issues you have described.
Well, I'll begin, Tom. We've been building a lot of housing for people experiencing homelessness with a diversity of faith communities. And one of the things that strikes me about that is how much the faith communities we work with are learning from those who are experiencing homelessness. These are people who have had adverse childhood experiences and literally have nothing. And to build on what Thomas said, this idea of nothingness is actually where a real spirituality exists. The faith communities we work with are actually learning that kind of the spiritual strength that comes from literally having nothing. And one of the other things we've learned from those who experience homelessness is they don't think of themselves as individuals. Community comes first. The only way they survive on the street is to have a community. And so one of the, I think, spiritual crises we have right now is that we have always assumed that somehow we're all autonomous individuals. And I actually think that one of the transitions we're seeing as we see, for example, the decline in attendance in organized religions, is that there's a shift toward a sense of spirituality and a sense of connection to larger communities, be it human or natural communities. And so I think that it's actually in the making of something as simple as a tiny home for a person for a community experiencing homelessness is where we will find some of the greatest spiritual richness, and actually where spirituality itself may exist going forward.
Thank you. So finding spirituality in places that perhaps we had not considered or recognized.
Don't think of as spiritual spaces, right?
Yeah. Can we have some responses from some of our other panelists?
So I would like to move from the micro to the macro, which is simply that I think my starting point is that I truly believe we are spiritual beings, trying to figure out what it means to be human. To elaborate, I think that all religious traditions, all primal cultures, have a spirituality that connects us to the earth. It may not be dominant, or it may have been looked over in favor of other narratives. But I think that ultimately we cannot solve the ecological crises that humanity is facing without a spiritual lens. I truly believe that we have to understand the earth and everything on it as a community of subjects, as Thomas Barrie would say, as a spiritual and sacred reality. Otherwise, we will continue, and I think this is the legacy of our Western secular worldview, is that we will continue to see the material world only for its instrumental value and not for its intrinsic value.
Thank you, Roberto.
Tom, could I follow
Please
on
do.
what Roberto just said? I think one of the things that is very clear in these critical conversations is that in this day and age, any spiritual orientation has to have an environmental component to it. And so I think perhaps that's one of the strongest lessons that we can take from Native traditions and Indigenous epistemologies. I mean, this sense of the interdependence of all things. And in this age, so often dubbed the Anthropocene, I think there are other traditions out there that represent a very strong rebuttal to the idea that humans necessarily have a dominant role in the environment. So I think Roberto has pointed to that as well as others. So I just wanted to underscore that point.
Yes, thank you.
Tom, can I jump in on this one too?
Yes, please.
So I really like the question because I would not want to presume that an informed spiritual orientation can necessarily address the issues we've been raising. There is all sorts of evidence that informed spiritual orientations work to keep from seeing, experiencing, and changing the kind of situations and injustices and colonial heritages that we're talking about, and earth violences that we're talking about. So I think it's a deep question to ask: what kind of a way of holding a spiritual orientation is actually an action-oriented way of holding it? Is a practice-focused way of holding it. I don't think that should be taken as a given. All sorts of people can hold various, even radical theologies that have very little effect on the environmental questions around them. So I think it's a deep question. It's going to take a lot more conversation, but it gets into the pragmatics of religious discourses and spiritual discourses. How do they change us? How do they become operationalized, as I was trying to say in my little piece there? I mean, for me, nothingness means radical every-oneness and radical everythingness. and so it's a challenge then for research. From my perspective as a researcher, it's a challenge of how do you study that about architecture? What is the radical every-oneness and everythingness about this architecture in relationship to this architecture? I also think one last point here is that if we're talking about how informed spiritual orientations address the issues we've described, I'm interested in the different ways that we've articulated what I would call bridging concepts. We've all brought something that can bridge out from our own vantage point, possibly into other vantage points. And I think as in a communal project like this, with communal intentions, as I understand it, looking at the kinds of language that can bridge out and welcome and be hospitable and reciprocal will be more likely to lead to action on these items, to build the kind of social capital that we've already been talking about.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Brian?
There's a comment. There's a comment that says, I feel pessimistic in today's materialistic society. And I think that certainly well expressed by Tom. And I just want to comment about being an educator and share credit for that sociogram, which was developed by a graduate student last semester. And as much time as we spend in architecture school drawing floor plans, that sociogram really struck me as even more critical, or at least equally critical to a floor plan, because what does a floor plan do? And so the floor plan, the building is the physical, but what is the impact beyond the physical? And I think if students are thinking about both and not just about the physical object they're creating, that's a whole different way of them thinking about metaphysical or spiritual or beyond the materialistic. So I really don't think I can ever go back to teaching just floor plans without having them diagram who's in the building, what are they doing, how are they changed when they've left, what about everything outside the building, the environment. So I think there's to me this is a way of thinking both materially and non-materially, or physically and metaphysically. And I think it's a move in the right direction, I think, for this rising generation that we're teaching.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, I think some of this is opening our lens to see and listen to others with an open heart, and also opening our lens to see things differently, things that perhaps we had not seen before. We're getting some questions in chat here. And one question that came is, how do you address the economics of spirituality and architecture and built environment development? And it seems either the person asked this can add more in chat if you would like, but it seems like this is addressing the culture of design of the built environment, and related to what Roberto talked about, is that we're very challenged to make major changes. Our default is minor adjustments, and it really relates, I think, to what does it mean to have a calling as a profession? What would it take for us to recover that sense of higher purpose? So could I throw that to our panelists to pick up in any way that you would like to?
Well, one thing that comes to mind when I saw that question is just the way in which we've structured architectural practice, again, around a very Western, highly individualistic, kind of heroic model, and are dependent upon those who can pay our fees, who are usually the rich and the powerful. And one of the things I've argued for years is we need a public health version of architecture. We need an architecture where every person on the planet is our client, and that we need a completely different way to address the physical needs of humans and the rest of and every other species on this planet in new kind of models. And I think there's a moment now that we're in where the old model isn't working very well. We've done too much damage to the planet, to ourselves, to future generations, and that it's an opportunity for us to sort of reimagine what it means to be embedded in communities. Actually, it's a quite old idea of what the architect was, which was not this sort of person who gets on a jet and places his or her, design anywhere in the world where some client will pay for it, but in fact is deeply embedded in communities, addressing whatever those communities' creative needs are. So I think that we're going to see that kind of practice emerge this century.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if I understood the question entirely, but in terms of the economics of spirituality, I would argue that our current economic models, when it comes to architecture, have totally ignored what I would call the externalities or damages resulting from our methods and processes. All the things that have already been mentioned. And that, we have this incredible earth deficit that we're building up, which is ultimately going to have a profound impact on the users of our buildings. Right? So the economics of spirituality, or maybe put it another way, the economics of well-being, not only for our clients and the building users, but for all life on the planet, is something that has to be considered, or the consequences will be, unimaginable. We can no longer believe that externalities don't matter, as it were.
Yeah, thank you.
Tom, could I just pick up on that point and
Yes,
also,
please.
yes, also underscore what Thomas Fisher said. It is, many of these ideas are not new. And I think it makes sense perhaps to go back to Bernard Rudofsky, who was making many of these similar arguments back in 1964 with his exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art on architecture without architects. In which he was essentially saying that our concepts about architecture are extremely limited. Our ideas about buildings and the cultures that have actually built buildings it's very narrow from a historical point of view. So I think that Thomas Fisher's right, that we do have a long history to look back to that talks about the need to broaden our understanding of what architecture is or what it can be.
Thank you, Karla. Bryan, I'm going to take a chance and call on you because I know in your work that you, in many ways, have been, re-envisioned what the practice of architecture could be. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Tom. Thanks. And it's interesting to think about architecture without architects, because I really feel we have such an important role we can play. I'm not sure there are others that can play the particular role we have in terms of imagination and creativity and impacting the built environment. Now, that being said, I always feel like the best architect is the users group themselves. I mean, unfortunately, that's sort of an ideal that I don't think we will ever get to, where everybody has the ability to shape their physical environment. So we have that responsibility, and it's an incredible responsibility. I think the challenge is, I personally believe that we're the form givers. I'm not one who thinks, I mean, I've tried this before where you sort of turn the pencil over, and it's the, the same analogy people use to say, well, the surgeon doesn't turn his scalpel over to you, but a good surgeon does certain things like explain the process. I'll tell a quick story if I could. I had an earache. I was coughing for years, and in architecture school, they said I had tuberculosis, and I didn't, but I never could figure out what was wrong. I went to the infirmary. They looked up my nose, down my throat, gave me some cough medicine. Finally, I went to a doctor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he said, I sat down. He said, so where do you live? What do you like to do? And, oh, wow, this is a nice guy. And he said, so you live out in the country? Do you go swimming in lakes and ponds? And I said, yeah. So he looked in my ear and realized I had an ear infection from swimming too much, and gave me antibiotics for the ear infection. So it was only through that, being a really good doctor, which I just thought he was being a nice guy. Was he a great doctor? So I think the analogy here is that it's about respect. It's about realizing we have this responsibility for others. We need to understand and appreciate, because we do have a role of creating the built environment, but to the degree that we can understand what their vision of success. I mean, I use the term stakeholder because I realize, I have to be honest, I have a stake in this too. I'm not just some totally altruistic being who, serves. I have to admit my bias. I love to create architecture, and that's sort of the gifts I have here. So, but in that overlapping Venn diagram idea, I hope I can create something meaningful and of beauty that also meets the needs of multiple other stakeholders. So it's about sharing in groups, but it's certainly not designed by committee, and it's not designed without architects either. So it's a little description of what we try and do.
All right. Thank you, Bryan. I'm going to turn to a question that was posed by Prem. We have a number here that I'm going to try to get to our questions. And Prem's question is, how can we absorb embodied practice into our quest? The quest being, architectural, personal, and communal practices, both the internal and the external, which reminds me of, the Zen monk Bernie Glassman, who said, we work on ourselves while serving others, right? That there's no separation, they're reciprocal. Can I put that to our panelists and get your response?
Well, one of the things I mentioned was how, we've experienced this past year, what it is like to just communicate digitally. And it actually, I think, will lead to a renewed appreciation of embodiment, of being together in physical space, and the role that being in physical space has for us. I also think, though, that physical space is going to have to change because it's now in competition with the digital. And so it will make us ask, why come together? Why be in a space together? And actually, I think physical space will have more of a spiritual as well as an obviously social role to play, while a lot of sort of ordinary tactical transactional things will just happen digitally. And so I actually think physical space is going to be more important and more valued, having come through what we just did.
Thank you, Tom.
You know, I'm wondering, I like this question a lot. How can we absorb embodied practice into our quest? One of the things I've learned from Jin Baek's work and the Kyoto School of Philosophy on which it draws is that our corporeality is what connects us to it's our conduit to reality. It is our co-implication with reality. So the body is the place where the world, where we are the world, if I can put it that way. And this connects with what many other speakers have said today. I wonder, as someone who's not an architect, but who really is learning a lot from listening and overhearing the way that spirituality functions in architectural discourse and practice, is are there spiritual exercises in the architectural profession? And what does that look like? By spiritual exercises, I'm calling on theological language here that draws from ancient notions of ascesis, shapings of perception and attention that are body-based, and can involve all sorts of things, from how you meditate to what you eat, to how you walk, to what you read, to how you sing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So is there a repertoire of spiritual exercises that architects talk about, or that they might share? Is there a discourse around that? I'm curious.
Yeah, like in terms of somatic practices that engage with the built environment, things like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm thinking that there were, the question really opens up, there were dispositions, I'm guessing, to follow the logic here, there were dispositions of architects and the practice of architecture in the past that led to perpetuating injustices, and that led to participating in projects that we don't want to continue today. And so what are the different kinds of spiritual exercises that would facilitate different architectural dispositions today? Yeah, somatic, Tom, is a good word for it.
Yeah, would somebody like to respond to that on our panel?
Yeah, actually, there's someone else attending, another ACSF member by the name of Serica Bajoria, I think is the proper pronunciation, who's developed something that she calls a contemplative designer. And she uses a number of different exercises, which are mostly meditation based, and kind of trying to get out of our heads and into our bodies, as it were, to kind of inspire the creative processes, and particularly any sort of creative blocks we might have. I would also say, so any kind of, meditative practice that kind of makes you more aware of your physicalness in the world. So I also, think about people like Juhani Pallasmaa, who wrote The Eyes of the Skin, and sort of, the discipline of phenomenology that really, asks us to suspend all of our preconceptions and theories and whatever, and be fully present with all our senses when we experience either a religious ritual, or if we're walking out in nature, or some kind of a spiritual encounter. There are opportunities within that are recognized by architects to do that very thing, Tom.
It's also, I'll say, a great question. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One, one of the things that's happened in architecture in the last century is we've automated processes that we used to enact physically, so that we now have air-conditioned buildings rather than having to walk to a window and open and close a window, right? So a lot of the environmental practices we're talking about is sort of reimagining architecture as a tool rather than as a machine. And so that kind of somatic practice of actually having to operate your building physically is I think a ritual practice that we've fallen away from, and that environmentalism will bring us back to. But another point, I teach my smaller classes nomadically. Our students, they choose where we are going to learn, and they always choose places that are rich, embodied places with lots of sound. They don't want quiet. They never choose a classroom. Ever choose a classroom. They always choose places where there's other people, where there's a variety of a lot of daylight, a lot of other things. And one of the other things I find about that is that embodies the knowledge. In other words, it becomes a memory device. They actually remember what we talk about better by meeting in lots of different places that they choose. And so this idea of getting of education out of the head and into the body and into physical space is another somatic practice I think we need to rediscover.
So Tom, just following on that illustration, I think it raises the question of what the relationship of public space is to Zoom now. Whereas Zoom is so much now a part of our lives, just this incredible reliance on it. And I'm just wondering, to what extent it may completely change our idea of what public space actually is. It sounds like your students still want that social, psychological ability to connect with other people, which is very compromised on Zoom. So yeah, I just was curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, we're just now sort of discovering what this hybrid new normal is going to be. Actually, I'm planning on teaching both physically and by Zoom at the same time, so that because I think there are some things my students like. They like the chat function that we're enacting right now. This ability to have a side conversation, which is hard to do when you're all in the same space. And so this idea that, let's do in physical space what is best done there, and let's also keep the digital there to do what it does well.
Thank you, Tom. We have Sigurd has posed a question here, and referencing Edward Soja in terms of spatial justice. And those of you who may not be familiar with Edward Soja's work, he's an urban historian, and fundamentally, talks about how our environment is so much shapes our lives, and that injustice in the environment is, injustice to those, right, who live in the environment, and that takes, many forms, from redlining of cities to prevent access of populations in service of racism, to unsafe or unsanitary conditions that people have no choice but to live in. So Sigurd, its question was basically, how do we build justice? That's a big question.
Well, we're doing work with the Dakota people. And one of the things I've learned from the Dakota is there's no word for poverty and there's no word for homelessness in their language. Why? Because the community, they have no conception of the individual apart from the tribe, from the group. And so there's no sense of you being poor. And they also have no homelessness, because everyone's home is everyone else's. If somebody doesn't have a home, they're in somebody else's home. And so, part of this is the language we use. and the way we conceive of ourselves on the planet. We've divided the planet up. We think we own plots of land on the planet. We've separated ourselves. I mean, our whole Western worldview is fundamentally unjust. And so to me, the challenge of the 21st century, the century we're in, is not just environmental, it's spiritual, it's ethical, it's linguistic. It's a sort of a reconception of what it means to be a human being on this planet. And to me, that's an incredible design opportunity.
Yeah. In other words, we change ourselves, and thus we change how we build.
Yeah, just to follow up with Tom, Thomas Barrie would say we have to reinvent ourselves on a species level. That's what is required. And again, I think that the dominant Eurocentric views of ideas like justice and property have defined the sort of imperialist colonial kind of approach, and we really need to, as many of the other panelists are suggesting, is to reframe those notions from a more indigenous perspective. I mean, when Indigenous peoples in Canada developed treaties with the settlers, they didn't understand the notion of property ownership. That was inconceivable to them. So they didn't really understand, I think, what they were getting themselves into, because obviously those two cosmologies came into conflict with each other, and we all know, what the ultimate outcome was. But so I think we can learn a lot, as Tom and Karla suggest, from Indigenous peoples in like reframe our whole language. Like Tom would say, we have to put the Bible on the shelf for 25 years. We have to put our dictionaries on the shelf for 25 years, and really reinvent language and reinvent our understanding of all these concepts. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Let others jump in.
I'd like to raise a point that Tom Fisher's made in another article about democratizing or diversifying the architectural education and how inaccessible the education system is. And he actually wrote it before COVID, but it does lead us to think that maybe the digital opportunities of broadening education allows for a more diverse group of understanding architecture and practicing architecture. So as opposed to architecture without architects, it would be architecture from a multiple greater point of view that I couldn't possibly. My name is Bell, and I'm, very privileged. I can never understand that. So I think that's a way, when I work with migrant farm workers, I don't, they are trusting me to do some of these skill sets for them, but I always dream of a migrant farm worker who's an architect, who could really understand things that they can't describe to me without that education. So, so I think there's something between there, and it does have to do with justice. And I do, I want to point the finger first at myself as injustice. We had a Liz Ogbu speak here. I don't know if you know her. She's a Black architect. And she made the statement that blew me away. She said, "I am a white supremacist." And what she meant by that, she went on to explain, is that we're just such a part of this, whether I use certain words or not doesn't determine white supremacists. Our culture is white supremacist, and so is she, by being a part of this. So how do we make these changes? These are incredibly large changes that can actually have an impact on this sort of tradition and these institutions like architectural degrees and tuition and admissions and these things that make it a very inaccessible path to designing the built environment.
Yeah, thank you, Bryan. I know, Tom Beaudoin, you brought up in your question, and I thought it was, very kind of nuanced in a very productive way, is that, what practices, say, spiritual practices are engaged with or take place in architecture. And those of us who study, of course, religious architecture, know that the interrelation of religion, its rituals, and their settings is often very close. But there was something else I think you were getting at, and that was, spiritual practices in terms of professional practices. And I think, Bryan, you're getting at that also in terms of, in some ways, reforming, architectural education. And all of this seems to be, coming around with getting out of the soup, getting out of the cultural soup that we're all in, and that poses real challenges to emerge from with new perspectives.
Tom, I appreciate you saying that. And let me just elaborate very briefly on that. I think that, the question, Sigurd's question, what is, how do we go about justice? For me, it's a matter of thinking about the formation and the deformation that I have inherited when it comes to my professional practice. So how do I, and I started off in my statement saying I'm a white, able-bodied man, two important pieces of how I come into this work on built environments. So I need to be suspicious of my own capacity to answer the question about justice right away. And I need to make in the language of theology, a preferential option for those who have been disadvantaged by the inherited architectural agenda, if I can put it like that. And to start with those folks, their world, their reality, their needs, and to try to see spiritually informed architecture from that vantage point. So I get a little cautious if the spiritual exercises become apolitical or depoliticized. So I'm also wondering about the political character of spiritual exercises that help induct, especially those of us who inherit privilege, into another way of being. So what is the political character of the spiritual exercises as well? So I'll leave it at that.
And do you mean by political exercises of power and privilege?
Yeah, I mean, how we get, by political, I mean how we get formed to see who matters and what people deserve. And I think there can be a retreat into spiritual exercises that somehow are thought of as separate from politics, and from obligation, and from risk.
Thank you. Would someone like to respond to that, please?
I wanted just to raise in relation to what was just said that, Michael Benedict, I think, is a scholar who has really thought about what the spiritual might mean in terms of architectural education. And I think in some ways, his example, his books, his writing is appropriate in relation to these issues about spiritual orientation in architectural teaching.
All right, thank you. Okay, I want to just turn to perhaps a little bit back towards sustainability. And Roberto, you have, I think, very wisely talked about the importance of Thomas Barrie's work. And, he talks about that we're just emerging from technological entrancement, and that our call is to move from the Anthropocene to the Ecocene, seeing ourselves more as expressive of the world, not observers of it. And I'd just like to put a question out there, is that how would a culture change that considers the earth as sacred affect the way in which we come to understand the term ecotechnology and respond to its implications? How could a spiritually centered approach assist us in achieving a more benign, less exploitive human presence on the planet?
You know, one of my favorite quotes from Descartes, who has a lot to blame for our predicament with his mind-body split, but one of my favorite quotes from him was, he said, "I would rather change myself before I change the world." And so it seems to me that a lot of what we're talking about is a need for a spiritual transformation within us. In other words, that we have been trying to manipulate the world to serve us, and as several of us have talked about in this panel, as opposed to flipping that to say, how do we serve the planet? You know, as Roberto said, how does the planet become our client? And that's the start of it. And you know, it seems odd for architects to think about this, but I mean, these are what our colleagues over in ecology, that's their premise, that's where they start. So there are other disciplines that we could learn from to sort of reimagine ourselves, and just start from this moment on to say, okay, that is our client, and every decision we make has got to be with that client in mind, the earth. And we don't need permission, we just need to change ourselves, and in that way I think we can change the world to be a better place.
Yeah, thanks. Someone else like to comment on that? I'm sure, Roberto, that you have some thoughts to share about that.
Well, I was kind of hoping to hear from the others, because you kind of know what my position is. But thank you, Thomas Fisher, because I think you're spot on, and I'm glad there's another architect in the room that kind of gets that, you know. Yeah, I don't know how any other way to be if we're going to get ourselves out of this crisis. I mean, the end game is not pretty, right? we cannot continue business as usual. It's very short-sighted, and the other point, I think, and Thomas alluded to this, it has to be transdisciplinary. You know, we cannot. You know, I don't think architects are capable of solving all the problems on their own. So whether it's, you know, collaborating with ecologists or theologians or, you know, other disciplines, planning and poetry and, you know, music and dance, all those things I think have to come into play. And I think so part of that experience is an embodied experience as well. You know, I mean, I can see all these things coming together, you know.
Right, thank you. We are almost at time here, but we have time if anybody else would like to offer any additional thoughts. I see that our chat is doing very well. I have you know, two minds going here. Very pleasantly so.
Can I just add real quickly as a tag on to these last several really interesting comments. I've been inspired by the Black Reconstruction Collective, and I just went to the Museum of Modern Art exhibit, and I was looking at their manifesto very carefully, and they say, we take up the question of what architecture can be, not a tool for imperialism and subjugation, but a vehicle for liberation and joy. And they say they are encouraging creative agency and liberatory practices, uniting activists, scholars, architects, artists, and organizers. So I think that there's a lot in that statement that connects very well to what everyone's had to say here.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I think that is a very appropriate way to conclude today's session.